Welcome back to Visited by Voices live. Again, probably a video I should be recording in 5 minutes, but I'm going to spend some time with you tonight and just kind of discuss Resurrection. Resurrection is a movie that I'd been advised to see for months, and for whatever reason, I just hadn't pushed play on it. It wasn't that I didn't trust the opinion of the people who were suggesting. These were like really voices that I trust when they say something is good. But Resurrection was just one of those things that was under the radar for me, and I didn't know what it was, and I just let it slide. That was a mistake. While it's not going to break my top 10 movies of the year, it is certainly a film that any fan of kind of what I dislike being titled elevated horror, but it does have that title attached to it. Any fan of that subgenre should see this film. So if you like the A24 stuff, if you like The Lodge, if you like some of the indie stuff coming out of especially Europe at the moment, you should see this movie. It is a great example, and that's really the subject of tonight's little talk. It's a great example of a secondary narrative framework being used in horror, which is becoming more and more popular. It's not really terribly new. I would say that Cat People, the original Cat People, not the Paul Schrader 80s thing, already kind of went to this territory. And so when you talk about in the 40s, a writing style is being developed that has persisted until now. It's definitely worth noting that it took a long time to really gain popularity, but today it's an incredibly popular way to tell a horror story, both in fiction and more recently in film, especially with films like Saint Maud, which is probably the best example of this type of storytelling. But what Resurrection does that makes it worthy of having this talk is that Resurrection has really codified it completely in film language, more clearly than I think I've seen anywhere else. I will warn you that there's going to be spoilers here if you haven't seen Resurrection. So if you really don't want the movie spoiled, or if you haven't seen it yet, you might want to come back to this. I never delete live videos, so this will be around. No hard feelings if you turn away now because you want to see this film. And I'm not going to review the film, but I will say that I heavily recommend it. I would say that Rebecca Hall is a tour de force in this. This might be the best performance in the horror genre this year. Certainly for English language cinema, it definitely is probably the best performance. It's not a perfect film. There's things that I think hold it back from making it onto my top 10 of the year, for instance. And it definitely is. It's a film that has not penetrated as deeply into the horror community and into the conversations in the community that you'd expect from a film that is this well written and definitely well acted. So what is a secondary narrative, and why is it a popular way to tell horror stories today? Well, to understand, you first have to say what it's not. It's not simply an unreliable narrator, which is what people, I think, lump anytime a film throws a twist in which the main character is revealed to have a secret or a dual life or something like that. That's not what a secondary narrative is, because it's related, but it functions completely differently from a storytelling perspective. And I think the reason the horror genre has glommed onto it more than any other genre is because psychological fracture, which from the outside looks like mental illness, but from the inside looks like the supernatural, it is just a perfect bedfellow for this type of storytelling. So what secondary narrative means that there is a level of story that you're following on the surface. And then there's another story that's not actually being told, but is obviously what is really happening, because the surface level story that we're being shown is colored by the main character and their mental state. So like I said, it's not simply an unreliable narrator, something like Fight Club, in which a character is ultimately aware of their circumstance, right? That's different because we're not actually in the head of that character. We're being told. The narration in Fight Club changes the dynamic, as do a lot of the on-screen visuals. It was a very specific choice that was made. Resurrection starts with a shot of Rebecca Hall at her desk at work, and she's completely centered in the shot, and she's speaking to someone who was initially off camera. And that person is revealed to be an intern, and that intern is talking about trouble she's having with a man in her life. And this is really as important a scene as anything you get in the rest of the film, because it kind of is the movie. And from that very first shot, it's clear that we're getting all events from Margaret, which is Rebecca. I believe the character's name is Margaret. I should check that before yeah, it is Margaret. From Margaret's point of view. So everything we get from that first scene onward is shaded by her mental state. The movie progresses in a way that at first you think of her as, while not reliable and not stable, you think her perceptions are pretty accurate and that what we're getting is pretty third person, right? So we seem to be looking at her situation from 10,000 feet. But the film continues to descend and descend until by the end of the film, we're very, very obviously seeing everything from behind her eyes. So perspective change throughout this film is done very methodically. And it's done really in a couple very specific scenes. There are very important turns where the film either slows down or escalates the amount of viewpoint discordance. So let me give you an example, because that probably meant nothing to anyone but me. So that intern that she's talking to, we never see that character interact with anyone else. And the situation that that intern is describing sort of maps really well to the story that unfolds for Margaret. It should, because Margaret is talking to herself. The film never tells us this because it expects us to do the work. This movie also never really says what it's about, but I'm here to tell you this is a movie about trauma, mental illness, and abortion. Yikes, it's going there, right? So the horror genre is one of the few places where issues can be explored. So no matter where you fall on the political ideology about the abortion issue, it gets complex when you add additional pieces to it, right? So you can say you're pro-life or pro-choice, but are you still pro-choice if the person making the decision is not mentally stable? Are you still pro-life if the woman is a victim of manipulation or incest or rape? So these are tough issues, and they don't fit sound bites or even political ads very well, because once you have to explore them with any depth, you realize that the horror genre might be the best way to get at some quintessential truths, because we can fearlessly go into ugly places. And hopefully in that exploration, we can come to some understanding, some deeper empathy for both sides of the conversation, and kind of see a road where, a path to a center place, a meeting place in between them. There's a lot of very disturbing imagery in this film, interspaced with a lot of exploration of what it takes to be a parent. There's a criticism of kind of the helicopter parent viewpoint, but there's also a real empathy for someone who's been through horrific trauma. Margaret's character seems to have gotten involved with a man when she was very young, barely an adult, who her parents, who she describes as hippies, pretty much allowed to take from their house to his. And she describes having a child with him, and then she describes going out, and when she comes back to her apartment, finding two of the child's fingers, and her boyfriend says that he swallowed up their son. Now, that we understand on a strict interpretive level that can't be exactly right. There's something wrong about her story. There's something fundamentally fantastic about it. But there's also a truth to it, right? So what is this horrific myth that she's built, this personal myth that she has built? And the truth is that mythology is getting back to the real subject here, which is, was Margaret a young lady who got pregnant and was convinced or forced or gaslit by her boyfriend into having an abortion she didn't want to have? Was she mentally not fit to understand the situation? Something like that seems to be the case. And the fact that the movie doesn't hold your hand and give you an exact explanation really, really helps make this more than just a typical horror film. And it also stops it from being just a god-awful Lifetime movie, right? Because this subject matter could be made into one of those. I mean, it wouldn't be made for broadcast television, but maybe for cable or streaming service today, I could see it. There's no question that the psychological damage done to someone who's not able to make a informed, consensual decision could be huge, you know. And Rebecca Hall does a great job of trying to avoid reality, to the point whereas when the boyfriend shows back up in her life, if you watch the film carefully, when we first see him, we don't see him. We see barely a profile of someone, and we see her reaction to it, a growing just discomfort, and then terror, and something else. There's some amount of deep self-hatred in her reaction as well. When she confronts him in the park the first time on that bench, he says he doesn't know her. He doesn't know. They've never met. And in fact, he describes a different scenario where she walks up and shakes his hand and introduces herself, but she does not experience that, at least not consciously. But in the middle of him speaking, he starts talking as if what she ultimately reveals to be the backstory was absolutely reality. The film doesn't give us any tell, except for the fact that his words and his persona change in a heartbeat without any sinister mustache twirling at all. Is this just a regular guy that she's convinced herself is the boyfriend? Is she following this guy? Is she stalking him? Does she know he goes to that same park bench every night? And if so, does that mean she ultimately murders a man just out of psychotic rage? The film doesn't give you strong answers, but it certainly seems to be insinuating it. And I think that's probably the mark of great writing. So a secondary narrative, right? So on one level, we have a story about a woman who is being terrorized by an ex-lover. But on a deeper level, we have a story about a woman who's trying to come to grips with the fact that her daughter's going away to school and she's going to lose a child again, not to, a coerced abortion like the first time, but that's what's on her mind. And her daughter going away is the reason the ex-boyfriend shows up at that time. Another big tell in the movie is that the daughter has an accident on bicycles while drunk, but we don't see that happen. And if you think about it, in a different type of narrative, you would definitely have gotten that scene, right? You definitely have we'd have lots of scenes of the daughter going away and hanging with her friends, and we'd see the accident where she gets this huge gash down her leg, but we don't. Our introduction to the idea that her daughter has been in an accident happens when she receives a phone call. This is a clear tell that we are in her headspace. We're not in some omnipotent view of this same story. Also important that the idea of harm coming to her daughter is so immediately a trigger for this overprotective psychotic behavior. I know I've mentioned Smile too many times recently on this channel and elsewhere, but Smile is a film about a woman losing her mind, kind of. But since it doesn't utilize this technique, it just comes off as clumsy and awkward and amateuristic compared to this. And it's just about good writing, as it's always just about good writing. But Resurrection also tells you that we're inside a single character's perspective by the fact that Rebecca Hall is on screen like every moment of this film, because nothing really exists outside her as far as the narrative is concerned. And I think when we look at a film like Saint Maud, which is very, very similar in approach, although it has a very different specific point of trauma, but both films follow very similar paths in that we're having character studies of damaged people, and we're inviting the audience to participate in the experience of their unraveling. Certainly this could become a trope, right? This could be something that we see done one too many times and we start to laugh at it and poke fun of it, and maybe it'll be in a Scary Movie sequel at some point. But for right now, it's providing these kind of soulful, meaningful films. It's very interesting too that so far, whether you're talking Relic or Resurrection or Saint Maud, you could argue The Witch is part of this cycle as well, that it's all strong female leads. This kind of female trauma, it seems to be what is being explored, and certainly Resurrection, because of the subject matter that they chose, is probably the most explicitly female trauma. I wonder if in time we'll see a male counterpart to this. And again, not the Fight Club thing, because that's entirely different. For right now, I find it very interesting that at a time when we're getting so many films that want popular mainstream films that want to portray women as 100% virtuous all the time and men as either incompetent or evil, that these films are taking a much deeper and more soulful approach to it, whereas these are real characters who are really responding to trauma. This is not a fantasy of how a victim becomes a hero. And I think that is very important because it fits in that mold of what the horror genre is. It's an exploration of our dark emotions. Something like Miss 45, which is my favorite of its type of film, is a horror film because we cheer on a mass murderer in that film. And definitely that's a dark emotion, right? When you can be convinced that mass murder is a good idea. But there's no real reflection in that type of film. Even something like A Taxi Driver, which there you do have a male lead who lives inside his head. We still are allowed a certain amount of editorial content as a viewer into that process. Whereas Resurrection and Saint Maud, as examples, really they want you to experience what that character's experiencing and nothing else. Joker would be another example because it's basically Taxi Driver. Whereas the masculine character who is unstable, we still get a lot of opportunity to see them as the villain they really are, because that trauma is not as personal as the trauma in Resurrection or in even Cat People. So I think it's an interesting movement in horror, and it's something I'm fascinated with at the moment. And I think as a writing technique as absorbing as this is popular in the genre, it can only help us to get to the next level. This isn't the end of the journey. There has to be a whole lot more literary techniques and great screenwriting futurism, right, in the future to bring us all those new classics that we're waiting for. Because we can't just have men in white masks and knives and chainsaws buried in walls. That stuff can't last forever. So we need a way forward, not a way out of the genre, a way forward. And I think these films are doing an excellent job of allowing us that. Now, I'm going to ask something that no one's going to like here. Not that you liked anything I just said necessarily. I'm not judging. Why was this film not a theatrical release in America? Why? I mean, Rebecca Hall is a known actress. It's a handsome production. It's effective. It would have an audience, I think. It maybe not a sizable audience, but it would have an audience. So why is it just left to streaming services, and not even a major streaming service, to get this out there? And I think that is built into the very nature of this secondary narrative exploration of trauma. It's that they don't trust audiences to be, I don't want to say smart enough, but to be intuitive enough to follow both the surface level story and what the film is actually saying is happening. And I find that sad. I think we have to get to a place where we can have Terrifier 2 sit alongside Resurrection, and the same fans show up on different weeks to see both films. We have to find a way to get the industry to really, really, really trust us again. There was a time in the 1970s primarily when you could release all kinds of different films that broadly fell into the horror genre. From the lowest budget, dumbest, backwoods, chase them and hack them up nonsense, to the most intricately designed, studies of religious terror. But today, it's what people consider horror. It's very, 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 very narrow. And that needs to change. One of the things that we can do to help change it is, first off, do stream it. That stuff matters. But talk to people and talk to them about what these movies make you feel and how that's different than, Halloween Ends or Candyman or whatever. Because I think that as much good as something like Jordan Peele's Nope does for the genre, this type of film does a lot more. And it nicely kind of balances, because we do have two narratives in the horror genre at the moment, right? We have the people who will just want to celebrate what it is in this moment and what it was yesterday. And then we have people who are desperate to try and find the next thing, so that we can have a future, whereas in 20, 30 years, we have those new classics that we can look back on. I mean, in 30 years, Halloween will be how old? 70? I mean, there does come a point where we need desperately to have those new classics that we can all look back and say, hey, I remember the first time I saw that. This was my experience. And hey, what do you think that meant in this movie? I hope those are the conversations we're having in the future, rather than, who do you think is the hottest girl in the Friday the 13th franchise? And the answer is whatever. It's not a question really worth exploring. Whereas I think a film like Resurrection, or The Wasteland this year, if you didn't see The Wasteland, see Wasteland. They have real serious questions and real serious implications for the genre. All right, guys, I just wanted to stop in and say a few words about Resurrection Night. This was never meant to be a long video. Thanks for everyone who did tune in, and definitely check out Resurrection. I don't think there's a possibility that you'll be disappointed. All right. See you all soon.
In 1977, news anchorman Virgil Meadowlark had some kind of breakdown on national television. Started babbling, speaking in tongues. The network released a press release saying he'd had a stroke. Whatever happened, he never went back to broadcasting. Instead, he disappeared from public life for 3 years. Then, in 1980, he published a book, Perihelion. Bestseller right from the word go, which, by the way, is the first word of the first chapter. Go find yourself. It didn't stay just a book for all that long. Readers became converts. They pooled their money and bought a town, Meadowlark's childhood home, Badger, Wisconsin, and renamed it Perihelion. I run a company that does impossible things. Sometimes with words and smiles, sometimes with Kevlar vests and AR-15s. It all depends on the job. For this one, the Perihelion job, we're going to need more than communication skills and good aim. We're gonna need a fucking miracle.
Like, share, subscribe, all that fun stuff.
What? Wait, what?
I watched like 3 movies from 2021.